What do you get when you cross Never Trumpism and Drag Queen Story Hour? A few weeks ago on my radio show Critical Thinking with Andrew Coppins on Mojo 50 Radio, I touched on this topic a bit, but I feel like we need more detail and to close the circle or square the circle or whatever you want to say a bit more. As you'll recall, over the last 6 months, one David French has managed to tell us all that applying morality has no place in the public square when it came to drag queen story hours happening all over the country, in public libraries, viewpoint neutrality, and all of that. But in the past few weeks, he's also managed to tell us that we must apply our moral culture to the voting booth when it comes to voting for or against Donald Trump. So if you're following along at home, it would seem to suggest there are at least two standards of when morality should be in play in our public life. Yet French's own words throughout both pieces tell us he's not applying the standards uniformly or within the vision of the Founding Fathers that he espouses. All we have to do is go into the Wayback Machine to September of 2019 as French penned this piece for National Review, titled Viewpoint Neutrality Protects Both Drag Queens and Millions of American Christians. In the piece, he argues that public spaces like libraries where drag queen story hours are happening all over this country are to be viewpoint neutral and should be open to both the drag queen and the Christian to do their separate things. Forcing morality in the public square should not be a thing either. French argues, well, because protecting that viewpoint neutrality also protects Christians' right to use public spaces for meetings, worship, prayer, and Bible study too. French said in that very piece, quote, "Few American communities benefit more from court-mandated equal access rulings than the American Christian community. Strike down viewpoint neutrality as a principle or close public access to public buildings entirely, and you would suddenly find the doors of university classrooms, library reading rooms, and publicly owned civic centers slammed in Christian faces in cities across the land." Now, I don't necessarily have an issue with this statement taken on its own. As I'd like to say, the answer to bad speech is really more speech. Drowning out the bad speech and calling it out for what it is doesn't mean that you don't also give those speaking horrible things the air to speak them. But the problem for me comes in consistency of that neutrality. After all, what do you think would happen if you followed up Drag Queen Story Hour with, say, Bible study on the sin of homosexuality in that very same space? Would those drag queens that French advocated for in his piece in September be cool with it? Or would they demand it removed from the public space altogether? Would French stand up as wholeheartedly for the Christian group's right to speak as they morally wished in that same space? And make no mistake about it, Drag Queen Story Hour is a moral play here. They're not doing this out of just straight benevolence. They're doing it to normalize and indoctrinate children about so-called gender fluidity. They're doing it to make themselves feel good about themselves. And unfortunately, to normalize the sexualization of children as young as 4 years old. This movement is explicitly a way to normalize and indoctrinate children about so-called gender fluidity, saying so on their own website. Quote, "It's just what it sounds like. Drag queens reading stories to children in libraries, schools, and bookstores. DQSH captures the imagination play of the gender fluidity of childhood and gives kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models." This is not about anything other than pushing the LGBTQ plus political and moral agenda. Therefore, are we supposed to just accept this happening in the public square when they're pushing their morality on the rest of us? Viewpoint neutrality is about making sure that no group is denied the right to speak based on their politics, religion, or belief. And it is something that has long been established via law in the Supreme Court. What it isn't is a guarantee of equal outcomes. I would say let them speak, but do so maybe in a closed room on off hours where kids are not likely to be at the library. No one's saying they can't use the space, but you don't get to spread this kind of crap during prime time for kids to be there. I'd apply the same standard to racist or white nationalists or black Hebrew Israelites or Antifa. Go ahead, spread your crap agenda and morality because the law says you get to use the space, but you're going to do so on odd hours and with the least publicity possible. We as a moral society also have to make parents aware of what it is actually happening at these libraries and what this movement is really about. I would strongly suggest that the parents hold a lot of accountability here for leaving their kids to be exposed both figuratively and in some cases literally to these people. What parent thinks it's a good thing for their 4-year-old to begin to have to think sexually at all? Then again, we just had this sickening video of a mom allowing her little daughter to be given a lap dance by a drag queen as if that was a thing that was good and that parents should be doing. Whether you want to expose them to and then have them learn about LGBT things as part of a sexual education, that shouldn't be coming at 4 or 5 or even 9. That should come with natural curiosity about sex, which normally and biologically often comes around 12 years old. In the latest video, which I refuse to play because it's so gross, we have a parent exposing and indoctrinating their child. So perhaps we're already too far down the drain to come back as a society. This is not some cute little moment of dress up. These kids are going to have serious questions and confusions that require serious answers. Willingly exposing your children to that sexualization robs them of their childhood, and it's wrong. So maybe we have to fight the moral fight by standing up and educating parents about what this crap really is about, and make them think twice about voluntarily doing this. Parents also should be more aware of their surroundings should they choose to go to the library. Read the events calendar. Think about what's coming up and maybe not go to the library at all on those types of days. That would be the Christian moral case against drag queen story hours, while also holding that viewpoint neutrality should still be a thing. But for French, you shan't apply those kinds of standards in public life, and you certainly must have equal outcomes, aka leave your morality at the front doors of civic and public life. Got it, bigot? But French really stepped in it just 5 months later, as he attempts to rail against Christians who voted for Donald Trump, as the Never-Trumpers are wont to do. You see, French wrote a piece last week called How Then Should Christians Vote? Look, I'll spare you most of the moral preening done in the article because I trust that you are pretty much smart enough to find it on your own and likely to guess all the tropes included within that article. Instead, I'm going to fast forward to what can only be a very interesting bit of irony or straight up hypocrisy on French's part. That's because he quoted one John Adams. Yes, that John Adams of the Founding Fathers fame. French quoted Adams as saying, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." French continues in his own words, saying, "In other words, virtue is indispensable to the proper functioning of the American nation, and without that virtue, America could become, in Adams' words, the most miserable habitation in the world." Again, French just told us that virtue, read values or morality, is indispensable to the proper functioning of the American nation. Morality is indispensable. Indispensable. Defined as being absolutely necessary. Morality is absolutely necessary for the functioning of our nation. Yet 5 months ago, Mr. French, you were telling us all that virtue, morality, values, whatever word you would like to use here, those things weren't to be used in the public square. And that to suggest morality must play a role in who gets to propagandize in public spaces cannot be a right and just thing. But now, it must be a thing that we must remember because what? It involves electing government officials to office and somebody you don't like. Suddenly, morality is to be used in the public square? Sorry if I'm confused here, but it almost seems like French and other Never-Trumpers are just trying to have their moral cake and eat it too. French would continue, just one sentence later, by the way, to say the following, quote, "Put simply, the Christian salt of this American earth must preserve not just its laws, but also the core moral strength of its culture." Core moral strength of its culture. Okay, so what is that core moral strength? Well, according to French and our founding fathers, that would be Christianity. It would also be something that we must keep in place for the proper functioning of society. But French also tells us it shall only be applied at the ballot box, not in the rest of the public square. I'm just trying to be clear on what French is trying to tell us. I've got plenty of bones to pick with President Trump, his flawed character and ambiguous morality chief amongst them. So I do get where French is coming from when he talks about Christians who hold their nose or held their nose and voted for Trump last time around. But if we are to apply our core moral strength and Christian values to the voting booth, shouldn't we also be able to apply them to the rest of the civic part of our society, aka the public square. I find it really hard to square those two pieces of writing from French as anything other than never Trumpers going off the deep end in any attempt to take him down in November of 2020. But lest you need more proof of how twisted into a pretzel a never Trumper must get in order to make the case that Trump has to go at all costs. French goes on in his latest post to tell us, quote, "We can choose to not yield to the same spirit of the times." Of course, he only applies that standard to his plea for Christians not to vote for Donald Trump, and telling us there's a different way, that there's not a binary choice when it comes to elections. Now, I would agree with him on that last point, but I do find it funny that he's willing to tell us Christians that we should not yield to the spirit of the times, only to have told us to do exactly that some 5 months ago when it came to Drag Queen Story Hour. If morality only applies to the ballot box, is that any foundation of a moral society at all? I would suggest it's the final resting place of our morality, and that the fact that Drag Queen Story Hour is a thing that is widely accepted and cheered in our broader culture says more about where we are as a moral society than whomever occupies the White House. Besides, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, LBJ, JFK, FDR, and our great friend Woodrow Wilson. Were any of these individuals paragons of virtue and morality? 2 were racist, 2 had affairs while in the White House, 1 was a crook in the White House, 1 was a racist, a eugenicist, a socialist, and a so-called intellectual elite rolled into one. I'll let you figure out who that last one was. We've long ago checked out of the whole idea that virtue has any place at the ballot box if we're going to be honest as a society. If Christian morality is something that matters in the voting booth, well, Trump voters are far from the first nor the last to vote against those morals. So, Mr. French, you can't on one hand tell us that the nation was founded on a moral principle and for a moral people, and then tell us that those values and morality should only be applied at the ballot box and nowhere else in civic/public life. I mean, I guess you could, you just would be a hypocrite. Some would say that title fits pretty nicely with David French and for the Christian who would choose Donald Trump over their Christian morality as well. It's a shame that neither can see they are actually two sides of the same coin. Now, I'm just going to leave you with one last thought from French's article earlier this week, or well, last week actually, but quote, "One does not cure cultural moral cancer with more cancer. We preserve nothing. Instead, we hasten the decay." Does voting for Donald Trump hasten the decay? Does Drag Queen Story Hour hasten the decay or preserve a moral culture? I think the answer to both questions are sadly yes. And thus, morality should have a very important place in our public square, like the voting booth. What say you? Leave a comment below or follow on social media at The Coppins Show. I'll see you on Saturday at 5 p.m. Central Time for Critical Thinking on Mojo 50 Radio, as well as the Mojo 50 Radio Facebook page. Until then, Matthew 5:47.